Good morning, historians, and welcome to another fine edition of On This Day in History. And I hope you've all had a fantastic weekend. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. Today, we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into some ancient history, but of course, it still affects the world we live in today because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So, here's a short look at what happened today. Okay, so on this day in history, 330, these are all AD dates. So the city of Constantinople, or Byzantium, becomes the capital of the Roman Empire, but the empire was not renamed the Byzantium Empire at this point. Just want to make that make that clear. Now, in 1812, I just thought this was a bit of a fun fact, a dance called the waltz was introduced into English ballrooms. This waltz originates, well, from Central or Central Western Europe, most famously the Austrian waltz. You can sort of see it in the name, waltz, sounds pretty German to me. But it was considered at the time disgusting and immoral. How could anyone dance like that? These modern dances, oh, they're terrible. I want the old dances we used to do it right. These kids today, yeah, in 1812, the new dance being the waltz, that was the cool dance. That's what the cool kids were doing. And of course, it was considered to be terrible. Everything new is terrible. We all know that. In that same year, the British Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, was assassinated by a man named John Bellingham in the House of Commons in London. Now, I find this interesting for many, many reasons, but one in particular is the fact that you never really hear about this particular incident. You always hear about assassinations of American presidents. You never really hear about the assassination of a British Prime Minister. Why would you? It's not like that was important, except it was, of course. But what I did find quite funny about this is that descendants of both Spencer Perceval and John Bellingham would both be elected to Parliament at the same time. That must have been an awkward inauguration ceremony. One of the big things from today in terms of how it's affecting modern history and particularly how it affects how I see the world, I suppose, and many others of my generation. On this day in 1969, so 51 years ago, the British comedy troupe known as Monty Python was formed. Now, whether or not you know these names, Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, Michael Palin, I've put a link to my favorite sketch, which I believe you should check out. It's worth a chuckle. These are giants of British comedy that were incredibly influential. And it was one of the first, well, not one of the first, but one of the more notable incidents of comedians being taken very seriously in the sense that they started to shape the culture, influence the culture. People started asking for their opinions on political issues. They started shaping conversations. It was a very big deal. And on this day in the year 2000, India's population officially reaches 1 billion. And a lucky child by the name of Astha Arora was officially named India's billionth baby. So that means essentially there's about 1 in 8 people in the world living in India. So if you've got 7 friends, one of you statistically lives in India. Okay, that's not quite how statistics work, but you get the idea. Now, for today's deep dive, we are going to look at some somewhat ancient history, the Constantine moving his capital on this day. Now, technically speaking, the capital was not moved on this day. I should point that out. It was, in fact, only named on this day, but still kind of a big deal. So how does all this stuff happen? Well, it goes like this. The Roman Empire, maybe you've heard of it, was kind of gigantic. Now, even by today's standards, it would be considered quite gigantic. But by ancient world standards, it was gigantic. So much so that they were having trouble running it. And so they decided, you know what we're going to do is, instead of having this one giant empire, we're going to sort of split it in two. We're going to have a Western Empire and an Eastern Empire. You guys can run the East and we'll run the West. And that all happened, and that was fine. Okay, cool, settled. Until this guy named Constantine became emperor, and he decided he was emperor of the Western Empire. And he decided, you know what, I actually kind of like having one giant empire. And he essentially conquered slash reunited, depending which way you look at it, the entire empire again. And he decided that in order to consolidate his strength, consolidate his rule of the entire empire, he can't be all the way far away in Rome. So he moves himself into the east. And the city that he decided to make his capital becomes renamed. What do you do when you need a name? Your name's Emperor Constantine. Well, why don't we call it Constantinople? Makes sense when you say it out loud. So I want to point out the capital was actually moved in the year 324. And when we say he founded a city or he created a city, there was actually a city already there called Byzantium. That might come in handy, that name, a bit later for historians. And it becomes a new capital. But it was renamed and dedicated to Constantine on this day, the 11th of May, in the year 330. So that's when it officially becomes Constantinople, the name that you possibly have heard before. So it becomes a hugely important city. It is the focal point of silk trade routes. Now, the Silk Road or silk trade routes is all of the things you can't get in North Africa, Western Europe, Central Asia, have to be traded from East Asia. Things like silk, kind of like how it gets the name, silk trade route. So things would be moving along those trade routes, along caravans, shipped by horse, shipped by camel, all the way through into Europe. Meaning, if you were in one of the major ports, you could control all of the things that get traded through the rest of Europe, all things like incense and spices, things like that. So this might be another reason that the capital was moved to Constantinople, because that's where all the money was. And if you've got a lot of money coming into your empire, you might want to be there to make sure that you're in charge of it, keeping it safe, if you will, basically making sure that the money stays your money. And the people in the Eastern Roman Empire referred to themselves as Romans because, of course, they were part of the Roman Empire. Now, this will become slightly more tricky or intriguing a little bit further down the road in history. But even though they are considering themselves Romans, even though they live in the East, they don't live anywhere near Rome, and Rome's no longer the capital, but they call themselves Romans anyway. But they are distinguished because of their Greek heritage. Many of the peoples, I should say, of the area are descended from or related to Greek settlers that have been settling in that area, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not so peacefully, over the hundreds upon hundreds of years. So they're slightly different in terms of their ethnicity to the rest of the Roman Empire, but also in terms of their beliefs and practices. The form of Christianity that sort of evolves or develops in the eastern part of the empire becomes known as Orthodox Christianity, because it follows the rules of the Bible, the rules of Christianity, slightly more strictly than the rest of the Christian world. So in many times it is taught in history that there's only one kind of Christianity until the Reformation in 1500s, but actually that's not entirely accurate. There was Orthodox Christianity and then what was known as Catholicism or Roman Catholicism, with the church centered in Rome. So again, there's a religious difference, there's a cultural difference, there's an ethnic difference between the Eastern and Roman Empire, Eastern and Western Roman Empire, I should say. Now, over time, this Eastern Roman Empire changes, it transforms, because it's got all of its influence coming in through trade, it's got settlers coming in through trade, it's got a lot more money, it becomes a lot more dominant. It's got different cultural practices, different ethnicities, different values, if you will, and it becomes slightly different. So one of the big things that happens is Greek replaces Latin as the language of the empire. Christianity becomes much more important. Christianity would not be the official religion of the Roman Empire until the year 380. So even though Christianity is becoming much more accepted, much more popular, it's not the official religion of the empire as yet. So the pagan Roman past still has some influence. When we say pagan, that's kind of a word that means non-Christian religion, if you will. So this is people still worshipping the god of war, the god of wine, the god of the sea. Uh, all of those particular pagan gods are still being worshipped at this time as well. But it is important to note that from the mid 5th century, so from the mid 400s to the early 13th century, the early 1200s, Constantinople is the largest and wealthiest city in Europe. Okay, so the center of European culture is not in France, England, Spain, Germany, even in Italy. It is in fact in what is modern day Turkey. Okay, that is very, very, very important to realize that European culture as we know it today is somewhat dominated by the big three, the UK, France, and Germany. That was not the case for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. Okay, so this was him moving the capital. So he basically goes, hey, Byzantium, that's a great city. You know what? If I'm living here, we're going to name it after me. My name's Constantine. What are we going to name the city? Constantinople. Kind of a big deal moving the entire center of government as well. So if you remember nothing else, remember these key points, if you will. Okay, so the Western Roman Empire falls in 476 CE, but the Eastern Roman Empire, remember, it was sort of split into West and East for administrative purposes. The Eastern Roman Empire survives, and it becomes something somewhat different, and it's the Byzantine Empire, as it were. However, it is interesting to note those people would not have called themselves that because, of course, the city hadn't been called Byzantium since 324. So by 476, they weren't using that name anymore. They wouldn't have called themselves the Byzantine Empire. They would have called themselves the Roman Empire still, even though Rome is no longer part of their empire. So they still considered themselves Roman. Okay, so it wasn't until after the Eastern Roman Empire itself collapses, which is in 1453, that it was Western historians that started calling it the Byzantine Empire to sort of distinguish it from the Latin Roman Empire as a whole. So historians called it that. The people living in that empire would never have called it that at all, which is kind of interesting. So technically speaking, if you really, really, really want to play the well actually game, the Roman Empire doesn't actually end until 1453. So that could be a fun trivia fact for you guys to file away. Okay, so that's the standard term we use when we say the Byzantine Empire for the Eastern Roman Empire, if you will. But that is a name we gave it just to make it easier for our filing systems, or maybe to make it more confusing for history students. It depends which way you look at it. Okay, so it had a multi-ethnic character during most of its history. So what that means is it was sort of influenced by Rome, but also by Hellenistic traditions, which is the Greek settlers, the Greek influence. And of course, this predominant Greek element, we saw Greek become the official language. However, there's also the outside influences coming through trade and other settlement and other relations with the further eastern countries. And we see the influence of Islamic tradition, Islamic ideas, Islamic science was a major, 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 major influence on this particular empire. Keeping in mind that, you know, after the fall of Rome, they sort of burned all their libraries. Well, not they, but attackers burned all their libraries. They lost a lot of knowledge. Much of the knowledge of the Roman Empire is preserved by this Byzantine Empire, and in particular, preserved by Islamic countries, such that when you end up with this thing called the Enlightenment, the rediscovery of knowledge, a lot of that stuff was saved by the Byzantine Empire and by Islamic countries as well. A lot of things to do with medicine, sanitation, and science was all saved because, of course, the west of Europe, once the Roman Empire fell into ignorance and barbarism, and that's why it's known as the Dark Ages. It's not known as the we got rid of Rome and now we're awesome ages. As a matter of fact, life expectancy, technology, and culture were much, 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 much more advanced in the Roman Empire in Western Europe in, say, 300 AD than they were in the Dark Ages of 1300 AD. So if you said, do you want to live in France in ancient times, I'd say Is it part of the Roman Empire? If it is, I would. If it's after the fall of the Roman Empire, absolutely not. It would be an awful place to live. Can I live in the Eastern Roman Empire? Okay, I'll do that. Okay. Now, some key terms. Obviously, Constantinople is the name of the city, named after this guy, Constantine the Great. Kind of gave himself that name as well. But it was formerly Byzantium, the city. So a great way to start a great city is to simply just go to a city that's already doing well and work from there. So don't start from scratch. That would take too long. And that is where we get the term the Byzantine Empire. So that is all of the deep dive for today. I hope we've learned a few different things about ancient history, but I hope also you can sort of see why these boundaries, these areas are so interesting culturally, and why even to this day there are disputes in Greece and Turkey over certain cultural ideas where you can order the same coffee, and depending where you are, it's called a Greek coffee or a Turkish coffee. You can, of course, have order the same pastry, baklava, and they both claim to have invented it. But that is because it used to all be a shared culture and a shared heritage. So this is one of the most important reasons we need to learn history, to understand the lines on the map as they exist today weren't always like that, and the cultures and ideas cross those boundaries anyway. So identifying yourself with a line on a map that exists today doesn't often mesh with the culture that you may identify with as well, which of course could cross those lines at any time. So with all of that said, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you very much. See you then.